His Excellency Mr. Yasser Abed, the Consul General of Egypt in Sydney, friends of the Nicholson Museum, distinguished guests, welcome. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we speak, on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. As we share our own knowledge of, and teaching within this university, it's important that we pay respect to the knowledge embedded within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Most of you, I think, have heard me bang on about before the holy trinity of what makes a university museum. I think a university museum should always aspire to education, to research, and to public engagement. I think in terms of like an overlapping Venn diagram, there's no point doing research if we're not sharing it with the public. There's no point sharing it with the public if we're not sharing the collection with our students. And I hope today, with the Mummy Project, we're sharing with you one of those projects that overlaps all three of those missions for a university museum. You may have come across the Mummy Project previously when the ABC TV's 7:30 conducted a report on one of our coffins, a coffin for the lady Mer-Neith-it-es. Of course, that was over a year ago now. The project has moved on, as you will see. You may have seen this project being listed at the end of 2018 by the University of Sydney as in its top 10 most important scientific discoveries here at the University of Sydney, with one of our photographs, or one taken by John Magnuson, who you'll meet shortly, as the cover image on the university's website. The project has also, from there, moved on again. We're moving very quickly, doing new questions and using new scientific techniques to interrogate these most ancient of objects so we understand new information about them and have different and interesting stories to tell. We have a huge team of researchers as part of this project. You're not going to hear from all of them tonight, otherwise we'll be here forever. But I'll just name a few of the different elements that is happening under this sort of this flagship. Dr. Estelle Laser from the University of Sydney, Professor Zung Vu from the University of Notre Dame, Dr. Alan Middleton from the New South Wales Department of Forensic Medicine are looking at some of the bones in conjunction with Professor John Magnuson and some of the teeth. Dr. Carolyn Cartwright from the British Museum is looking at some of the wood from the coffin for species identification. Professor Boyo Ockinger from Macquarie University is translating some of the hieroglyphics. Dr. Glenda Susan Marshletts, one of our own friends of the Nicholson Museum, and who's here in the audience tonight, is about to start analysing the bandages, and so has just given us a grant money to partner with their scholar, Dr. Vlad Levchenko, to take some radiocarbon dates from one of the coffins of Mer-Neith-it-es. We're using some of the bones for DNA sampling here at the School of Life and Environmental Sciences. I could go on, but I won't, because we're really here to listen to the five that you're seeing here, of our leading researchers in this project. Before I introduce them, however, I think it's time to turn the lights off, if I can, and introduce the mummies themselves, which really is the reason why we're all here. The Nicholson Museum is blessed to have in its collection 3 Egyptian coffins, 3 complete Egyptian mummies, and of course, in the coffin of Mer-Neith-it-es, the remains of a 4th mummy. You will see this coffin of Merowe. It's on display in the gallery. We took the mummy from Merowe to Macquarie Medical Imaging in December 2016 for CT scanning. You'll see a very large banner of some of those results up in the Nicholson Gallery at the moment, but we won't be seeing Merowe this evening. Pediashiket, of course, one of the most famous coffins we have in the collection, was purchased by Sir Charles Nicholson in the 1850s. All of these mummies in the coffins were purchased by Nicholson in the 1850s. The mummy inside this coffin is an imposter in this coffin. The mummy dates to the Roman period. Nicholson was purchasing off the market in 1858. He was probably sold this mummy in the coffin as an ensemble piece. We don't know who this mummy is. Nicholson thought he knew who this mummy is, but the CT scanning is giving us new eyes onto who this person actually was. You won't be hearing much about Pediashiket tonight either. You will be hearing quite a lot about Horus, and this is really the first half of tonight's presentation. The mummy of Horus is on display in the Nicholson galleries at the moment. Horus is the mummy of a small boy, probably about 6.5, 7, and Horus was, 10 years ago, subjected to CT scanning with Dr. Janet Davey and Michael Turner. The CT images are wonderful, but the CT images you're about to see now that were done 10 years later are simply astonishing and show you the development in technology and expertise that's happened within the last decade. Now, Professor John Magnuson from Macquarie Medical Imaging will start to speak in just a moment, and he will take us through the CT results, particularly of Horus, to show you what CT can do and what new things we're learning about these mummies. John Magnuson is Professor of Radiology at Macquarie University, and when I was seeking out the best facility to take our mummies to, all roads led back to John Magnuson. He had CT scanned mummies with the Australian Museum. He had done CT imaging on archaeological ceramics from Italy and from Pompeii. He was described to me as being a bit of a mummy whisperer. You will soon see why. One of the real pleasures of this project has been to collaborate with Macquarie Medical Imaging, who have simply some of the most up-to-date and most astonishing kit for this sort of stuff in Australia. We CT scanned our Jericho skull late last year with Dr. Alexandra Fletcher from the British Museum. She said to me, make sure you get the best. Have they got this, this and this? And I said, I think they do. She then saw the CT scan produce its images of our Jericho skull, and Alexandra's jaw dropped, and she said, well, you've just done in 30 seconds what it took my guys at Imperial College 2 months to achieve. I said to John, I think Alexandra is saying you've got better equipment than Imperial College London. And he just smiled and went, I know. The third coffin and the fourth mummy is of Mer-Neith-it-es. This is the one that featured in the ABC report. We took the lid off Mer-Neith-it-es just over a year ago. In a previous catalogue done in the 1940s, the coffin was described as being empty. We were hoping to find a few bandages and beads. What we found was really quite amazing. The remains of a mummy that had been torn apart by various tomb robbers. We thought long and hard about what we do with this, and I won't tell you what we did with this, because after John, Dr. Connie Lord will tell you how we treated these remains. Dr. Connie Lord did her doctorate looking at 10 mummies from the Dakhla Oasis at that powerhouse Egyptological Institute at Manchester University. We do not have a permanent Egyptian curator here on staff at the Nicholson. That's a problem. Should anyone ever want to sponsor an Egyptian curatorship, then boy do I want to speak to you. But we're very lucky that we've got Connie for this year and for last year to help us achieve these exhibitions and this research. When she's not head down, bum up, digging a trench in Amarna in the Nile Valley with an international team, for that I'm not jealous at all. After Connie, you will hear a little bit from Therese Harrison. Now, Therese is a newly appointed professional officer for museums analysis, and that is with a new facility called Sydney Analytical. This is one of the university's core research facilities that do things like vibrational spectroscopy. Now, I could describe that for you, but I'll choose not to, and I'll let Therese do that, but she's been analysing a lot of the contents from this coffin to tell us materially what this stuff actually is at the most basic elemental level. And then finally, we're doing something which, to my knowledge, no other museum has tried to do. You will see that this coffin looks very faded and very dark. It was once vibrantly, wonderfully coloured. And so we've partnered with Dr. Andrew Howells and Dr. Bernadette Drabs, who work at the School of Creative Industries at the University of Newcastle, lecturing in scientific illustration and technical drawing. It's wonderful to have them here tonight because Bernadette has literally walked off a plane yesterday from working at the University of Sydney's excavations at Pella in the Jordan Valley. I'm surprised she's still upright. But enough from me. I'll hand over to Professor John Magnuson, who will take you through some of the CT scanning. John.
Thank you very much. That's a stunning introduction. I have always loved taking pictures. Ever since I was a little boy, I loved taking pictures. For those who have the memory that goes back that far, used a thing called film. It comes in strips. It has little notches down the side. It used to play vertically through a projector in movie theatres when they had such things. When it was vertical, it was 16 millimeter. When it was sideways, it was 35 millimeter. And I took pictures of lots of things. And I like taking pictures because they capture memories and they tell stories. And this tells a story. This brings back memories for me. This little girl, so at the time of this picture, she's about 4 or 5. I was there when she was born, which didn't go smoothly because she had her cord wrapped around her neck and it still upsets me, she was dying. And it went to an emergency Caesar and we pulled her out and the pediatrician and I took her across to the resuscitation table and we put her down, and it's not a very big table when you have a little child, and there's a heater lamp on the top to keep them warm. And if I let the microphone drift away from my mouth, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So we put her down and she was blue. And babies are not meant to be blue. That's a bad sign. So we started to suck her out and we resuscitated her and we cleared her lungs and she went pink. Oh, that was good. And the pediatrician and I looked at each other and we felt so relieved. And he thanked me for my help, and that was fine. And I said, just excuse me because I need to go back and be with my wife. But they tell other stories, not just of the living, of my daughter Sarah, but of this person. This is a PET scan of a lady with breast cancer. And the black dots, most of them are not meant to be there. And that's where the breast cancer has gone that it was not meant to go. And so sometimes we take pictures of the living and sometimes we take pictures of the dying. But thanks to Jamie and to the Sydney University, I'm incredibly grateful because I got the opportunity to take pictures of somebody long dead and bring them back to life. And isn't that incredible? And when you go back to the museum afterwards, you can look at Horace, but here's Horace lying on the CT scanner table just before we did the scan. And so you can see on the left is what Horace looks like from the outside, but the amazing thing is what we can see on the inside after just 15 seconds of scanning. Now, the year in between was what it took us to get the data from the scan part to the really pretty part on the right-hand side, and that's what I'm going to take you through a little bit tonight. Now, all of this technology is much newer than the mummies, of course, so it wasn't until about 1839 that photography got introduced, and if I'd been there back then, I probably would have taken a photograph of the outside, just in black and white, of course. But by 1896, Röntgen had discovered X-rays, and this is the sort of picture that Röntgen would have taken of the mummy. And that's what you see in a lot of places. It's just the shadows cast by the mummy in a bright light. So if you imagine here's a chest X-ray, and chest X-rays are just the shadows cast through the body. If I drop the lights a bit more, because to be honest, oh, this is off. Wow. This is really bright for me. I'm a radiologist, you see. So years ago, I used to be into diving before I had children. Children are sort of Dr. Paddle at the moment with diving. And so my diving watch was solar powered, and it lasted me about a decade. It was a tried and true watch, and then one day sitting in the reporting room, I noticed that the watch had stopped, and I thought, oh, well, it had done its job and it's past its time. But I gave it one last chance, so I set it under one of those desk lamps that were halogen, for anyone that still knows what a halogen light is. And after about 10 minutes, it came back to light. So one of the main hazards, work hazards as a radiologist, is in fact vitamin D deficiency. So if you imagine X-rays are just the shadows that are cast. So if you imagine that there's the shadow from my hand, but if you could shine a much brighter light through it, then you would see this sort of picture of a chest. But X-rays are not enough to get the pictures that we saw or we want. So we use CT scanners instead. The one on the left, what we colloquially call the baby CT because it's small, not because we scan babies. And the one on the right we call the big CT for obvious reasons. On the inside, they're pretty complicated things, and as you can see on the, well, if I can get the video to play on the one on the right, we'll see videos are always the enemy of PowerPoint. So here's what it looks like with the cover on. We don't scan it with the cover on because not many people would go in there. Can you imagine? Breathe in and hold your breath and make sure you keep your arms by your side. But really, it's all just shadows. And here's the shadows, if anyone's done the sculptures by the sea, this is down at the beach, and beautiful shadows. But CT is not that much more complicated. It's just a bit like, so here we've got a light. Let's see if I can shine that shadow onto the wall. And there's an X-ray. But if I want a CT, all I do is rotate it and catch a series of pictures. Now, already in your mind, just by looking at those series of pictures, you can virtually reconstruct what this object is. Now, in real life, of course, the planet doesn't move, the sun moves, as you saw on that video of the X-ray scanner going round. And it's that we use to collect the data. And so here's Mer-Neith-it-es being loaded on under the watchful eye of Connie in the background there, and a lot of very nervous people as we put Mer-Neith-it-es onto the scan bed. Now, we scanned Mer-Neith-it-es first because Mer-Neith-it-es was the biggest one. We didn't know she'd fit. Luckily, she almost did. You'll find out about that later. And so it didn't take us long to get these sort of pictures, which were already amazing. But what I'd like to take you through tonight is how, and so here's one of the other images, how we convert from an 1896 picture into a thinner slice. We remove all of the shadows and just look at one thin layer through the body. And once we see that thin layer, we can start to pick out the detail and start to look at what's inside. Now, when they first come up, this is what it looks like. Slice after slice, all 2,400 slices. And this is going from feet to head through pores. And you can already see, it's just incredible, the detail of the wrapping, of the bones inside, the body cavity, the areas that have been emptied out. And the sort of questions that spring to mind, just when you're looking at that, is incredible. But for me, so the problem for me is that I spend my life looking at these single images. I look at 50,000 of them a day some days. And I'm good at synthesizing them into a three-dimensional whole. But that's not how most normal people spend their day. So what instead we do is explore the three dimensions. And a bit like a sculptor, we start off with a block of data and start to take away. So as we take away from the outside, we can reveal parts of the mummy on the inside. And we can choose which parts of that data we take away. And when you go back to the museum, I mean, I was standing there before I came to give this lecture, and it's just stunning to see in real life, and then to see on the screen what is possible. I'll warn you, CT, like X-ray, is black and white. There is no color in CT or X-ray. So all the colors that you see tonight, you can blame on me. Poor choice or good choice, they're all down to me. Now, of course, we've got the mummy. What we need to do next is take away those distracting things like the bed from the back. Because whilst the bed, as you can see there, is in its way, it gets hard to be able to have a look all the way around the mummy. So we'll take away the bed. And then what we can do is virtually look all the way around the mummy. Now, you've all heard lots about augmented reality and virtual reality. This is virtual reality. This is you and I with X-ray vision looking at something from 2,000 years ago. And of course we can choose which part of it we look at, and I can change which bits are displayed. So for instance here, assuming the video plays, I can take away some of the surface layers to reveal the mask, which of course doesn't have the color printing because I can't pick it up. But then I can start to zoom in and show more of the detail. And because this is a three-dimensional data set, it's easy to explore different features. And as you can see here when it's turned sideways, there's the mummy, there's Horace. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. That's just amazing that we can look through all of those layers and start to see the small child underneath. Of course, we can take away or just give transparency to all the layers and start to see Horace in all of his glory, which is just incredible how well preserved this mummy is. Here, closing in on the head, what looks like things over the eyes are in fact, anyone guess? Sinuses? No, those two lumps that seem to project now back down there. What have little children got? Yeah, the molars. Molars up the back. And you can see what are these two up here, these big ones doing? Yeah, waiting to come through. You know, the big central incisors that come down that make a 7 or 8 year old look like they've got buck teeth. That's what we're seeing here. But of course, what is also arbitrary, remembering that all the colours are just artificial, what we can do is change the colours to represent different densities, and with that, bring out different detail. So all I've done here is change how it's displayed so that we can much better see the teeth, which is amazing because here you can see a secondary dentition all waiting to come through. So how old is Horace?
6.
How do you know?
Sometimes Jamie's wrong.
Do you think he's right?
I think he
That
is.
was an overwhelming response. Wow, okay. So, central incisor should lose primary around 6 to 7 years. So it's pretty good. Bet that Horace is about 6 to 7 years, but there are other ways that we can look at that. So here is just almost a summary picture of the wrapping of some of the skin that can be visualized that's left and dried, of course, and then the bones underneath, all in one go. And here are 2 small objects left over the eyes, just to cover the eyes. Now, you didn't see them in any of the other pictures because their density was too low to show up compared to the bone. So what I did for this picture was treat them separately and put them back into the picture so you can see it at the same time. So they're not ceramic or anything like that, but the eyes have been covered, which is just beautiful. wonderful picture of how it all fits together, sometimes it's important to look inside. So here's part of the pelvis, lumbar spine. There's the skin on the outside of the abdomen. And here's the defect. Here's where the skin has been cut and the organs removed. Now, when we measured this on the CT, of course we can measure everything, it's only about 7.5 centimeters long, that hole. So it's not a very deep hole. And then he would come back in and pack it to hold things open. Or here, up in the middle of the chest, about this high, debris has layered out in the back, and the chest is completely empty. And you can see all the layers of the linen wrapping on the outside. And that one bright white line is the carapace over the top, that beautiful coloured piece that you can have a look at again when you go back to the museum. And here, the head, of course, bowed down onto the chest. And for children, because their head is so big compared to their body, if you lie them flat, if you lie a little baby flat, their head will do that. And when you go to resuscitate children, you have to have padding underneath their back to keep their head back, otherwise they lose their airway. And that's what's happened. This child's head's tipped down, and there's the hole through the ethmoids, through the top of the nose, through which the brain cavity has been emptied. Back to the teeth, which is just amazing, the detail that we can see. So not only did we do the big scan, but we came back, we used that little baby scanner off on the left, if you remember that, to get higher resolution through the teeth. Here's another way that we can age Horace. Has anyone ever had an X-ray of a child to work out how old they should be? No. So this is standard. We take one picture of the left hand and we compare it to an atlas. It happens to be the Atlas of Grulich and Pyle. And by looking through that, can work out by the development of the bones in the hand how old they should be. Now, the interesting thing about Horace, so Horace is only about 105 centimeters tall. 105 centimeters in modern times should put Horace at about the age of 4. But by the teeth, 6 or 7. By the carpal bones in the hand and fingers, also about 6 or 7. So short but mature. And when we looked at the bones, there were no growth arrest lines, there were no indications of terrible things which had happened, which had stopped Horace growing. But of course, we do know that in modern times, with increased caloric input, we will end up a bit taller. And so here, you can see, with the wrapping intact and with the semi-translucent wrapping, an overview of this just amazing mummy. It is incredible. And it was a real honor for my team and I to be involved. You can see how happy they were that day. I had to ask them to smile. they were really pleased to be there. So thank you, Jamie. I am eternally grateful because this is a wonderful adventure. And although we've spent a year getting this far, we have only scratched the surface. We may have scanned in 15 seconds, but there's a lifetime of analysis to do. And I'll leave you with this picture of Horace. Thank you.
Jamie told me I had to use the handheld microphone, but I like to wave my arms around a lot, so I hope you can actually hear me from here. If not, please tell me and I'll attempt to do whatever this thing does. My presentation isn't going to be quite as whiz-bang. It was a lot more dirty, what I'm going to speak about. And I am going to stand back here because really Mer-Neith-it-es, she speaks for herself and I shouldn't get in the way. Also, I have a script because if I don't stick to 10 minutes, I'll get in trouble. And I seriously could talk about her for about 6 hours. No one really wants that. But at first glance, the coffin I'm talking about tonight is certainly not as eye-catching as the other Nicholson coffins, especially if you compare it with the bright colours of Pate Eshikut from the 25th dynasty, or the raised relief modelling of the coffin of Merowe from the 21st dynasty. As Jamie said, these are both currently on display in the museum. However, the coffin and the contents of Mer-Neith-it-es have given us a unique opportunity to not only utilise cutting scientific techniques, the results of which will just add to our Egyptological knowledge, but it's reminded us what an interesting and captivating piece of history an individual object can really be, and how the information from an individual object can become part of a much broader context. Before we started this project, as Jamie said, we knew the coffin had been dated to the 26th dynasty, so around 600 BC. It comes from Saqqara, part of the Memphite necropolis near modern Cairo. It was purchased by Sir Charles Nicholson from a dealer in Egypt, so sadly the burial context is completely lost to us. And any notes and other information Sir Charles might have recorded were destroyed in a house fire in 1880. We knew that there were some disturbed remains inside, but neither the coffin nor the contents had really been the focus of any detailed study. Oh, technology. So in the 25th and 26th dynasties, around the 8th century BC and onwards, there were significant changes in coffin design, and these were most obvious in those coffins made for persons of high status. These individuals could now have up to 3 nested coffins of different forms. The outer being was mostly rectangular with a vaulted lid. The middle was usually a flat-based, sparsely decorated anthropoid model. And the inner coffins, which used to be cartonnage, were now wood and added a rectangular plinth and were supported by a back pillar, far more reminiscent of statuary and figurines than the earlier coffin designs. They included substantial text from the Book of the Dead on both the external and the internal surfaces. So our coffin that we see here certainly adheres to some of the 26th dynasty norms. Got it. It has the large rectangular plinth, which you can see just there, and it has this back pillar, which you can almost make out. It has the broad, flat, tripartite wig and large Wessex collar. So you've got that, and then the collar, which are also very typical of the 26th dynasty. Our coffin is certainly for a person of some status, probably low elite, but there are some elements of the coffin that hint at a higher rank. Unfortunately, we only have an inner coffin. Whether Mer-Neith-it-es had others, it's impossible to know, because as I said, the burial context is lost to us. Also, even though Mer-Neith-it-es's coffin was constructed of cedar wood, which was a status item in itself because it had to be imported from Lebanon, some areas of construction, and you can see that here in the baseboard, the base of the footboard, some of the construction is pretty rough. You can also see it around the shoulders, they're very uneven. In September 2017, we decided to open the lid. I'm not sure many of us, myself especially, thought there was going to be much to see. However, as soon as the lid was removed, we could see that it certainly wasn't empty, as Jamie said. It's hard to see in this photo, but most of the contents had moved up towards the head area, so up around here. And it's obvious that the coffin had been severely looted in ancient times and possibly again at the time of excavation in the mid-1800s. It had also travelled by boat to London and then later Sydney, which would have disturbed the already unstable contents even further. On the surface, we could see some human bone, mostly fragments of long bones, including some lower limbs still partially within wrappings with a hard resinous coating, and that you can just see in the corner up here. We also had large chunks of resin, some of which appeared to be decorated, and examples are just here and further down. While we are not sure of the date of the contents at this point, resin, usually a coniferous tree sap, was used extensively at this time as an adhesive and a preservative. So here we just have a close-up of the contents, and as you can see, we've got, oops, no, that's wrong. We've got the long bones, there's that wrapped part up there. We have a lot of textile and more bone fragments, modern packing material. But if you look closely, one object seems to be more obvious than anything else, and these are beads. Cylinder and, cylinder and disc beads were everywhere and of different colours and sizes. It was clear that the mummy had been covered in a bead net, and from the number and variety of disc beads, it would seem that this net was quite elaborate. I'll use the mouse here because once you get your eye in, you really can't stop seeing them. If Julie's here, she'll probably hate looking at this. There's one there. Oop, again. There's one here. Is that my pointer working? It is? Okay. There's one here. There's a cylinder bead here. There's a cylinder bead there. There's a cylinder bead there. You get the picture. We collected over 7,000 of them. So here are just some examples of bead nets. We have this really simple one that's actually a recent acquisition for the Nicholson Museum. These were popular from the 25th dynasty onwards, but by the time we get to the 26th dynasty, these faces become incorporated into the bead net. And you can also get further decorations. We have winged scarabs, and we have the 4 sons of Horus, and a bit of the offering formula. Now, our bead net is far too destroyed for us to know whether we had a bead face, but we certainly have the colours and the numbers of disc beads for this to be a possibility. I've just put a slide in here of the textile that we've been looking at. The scientific analysis of the textile is actually going to start in earnest next week, thanks to Dr. Glenda Marsh-Letts, who's in the audience somewhere. But what we know so far is that we have at least 2 types of linen or textile. They're both pretty good quality, but one is much finer than the other. We also have evidence that items of daily use were used as part of the wrapping. This means sheets or clothing were made into bandages, but we also have evidence, we think, of bandages that must have been especially made for the burial context. Now, most textile in ancient Egypt was linen, therefore made out of flax. So this microscopic image here just shows us, if you look very carefully, it's quite damaged, but there are flax nodes, the nodes of the flax part. So no surprises. We have a lot of textile and it's linen. So we didn't decide to remove the contents from the coffin straight away. We planned a number of measures to record as much information as possible to ascertain whether or not the excavation was even necessary. Firstly, we looked into other museums that had done something similar in recent history, and we found that the Bergdorf Museum of Ethnology in Switzerland had done so in around 2013. Like us, they had a very deteriorated mummy that was past the point of preservation as a whole entity. Unlike us, they removed the contents of the coffin first. It took them 2.5 days, and after this, they scanned only the head. Even so, they were able to ascertain the sex and age of the occupant, as well as discovering burial goods such as cartonnage coverings and a gilded face mask. Many of these discoveries would not have been possible if they hadn't excavated the contents. However, we decided we needed to record the coffin in as much detail with the contents in place before we did anything else. So, with a Sydney-based engineering company called WYSIWYG 3D, we made a 3D, really, that's what it was called. We made a 3D rendition of the coffin with the lid on and off. This was 3 days of taking thousands of photographs and laser light scanning, which is basically shooting lasers at the coffin from all angles. The results of which has given us the largest digital model of any museum in the country, and I will play this at the end of my talk. We also, as you've heard, scanned the coffin and the contents at Macquarie Medical Imaging. So after high-resolution photography, CT scanning and 3D modelling, we had really used as many techniques as we could to record the contents while they were in situ. But still we had the question, should we remove them? If this was a complete mummy, we would not even consider disturbing it. However, this was an extremely disturbed set of remains, most of which were not human, but resin, textile and beads. But still, we had to ask ourselves, does this make it okay? In the end, the decision was really made for us. As it was moved after, after CT scanning, we noticed a weakness in the back of the coffin, and some of the fine dust was falling through. We thought that removing the contents would lessen the weight and hopefully stop any further fracturing of the wood. Even though it was done in a room on the first floor of Fisher Library, I came at the process of excavation the same way I would in the field, by firstly dividing the coffin into grid squares. And I worked as much as I could in one square at a time. While the contents were obviously not in their original position, the object designation to a specific grid square is helping us now when we go back to CT scans and try to identify things. I sieved all the dust and debris as I went along. It took 6 weeks. I don't know how they did it in 2.5 days. So here we just have an image of before, during, and after. And when I talk about the grid squares, I did one longitudinally, and I had true right, true left. Then I did 4 laterally. So I had R1, R2, R3, R4, L1. You get the picture. And I tried to work as I could. Obviously, down here, it was a lot less, and it didn't take nearly as long. Also, sorry, you can see here the empty coffin. Unlike other 26th dynasty coffins, ours was certainly not decorated at any time on the interior surface. While I was always aware that I was disturbing the remains of someone that never would have wanted this, the excavation was amazing, and every day was exciting and surprising. Some of the most interesting finds, as we can see from these CT scans, included the perfectly preserved mummified feet. You can see them coming through just up here, and then here they are in all their glory. We also found a resin endocast, which is this spherical object. So it's just here, and then just here. It is the remains of molten resin that would have been poured into the skull after the removal of the brain. A good example of an endocast can be seen in the X-rays of the skull of Tutankhamun. There are a few X-ray images, but finding an actual endocast is at the very least very incredibly rare, and at the best, unique. There were also smaller objects that we couldn't see in the CT images, such as a beautifully moulded and anatomically perfect resin ear. Now the contents have been removed, bioanthropologist Estelle Laser has begun looking at the human remains, and these, along with the examination of the resin, textile, and other objects found, lead us to the conclusion that the highly disturbed contents within the coffin of Mer-Neith-it-es belong to a single individual. So the big question, is this Mer-Neith-it-es herself? We may never know, but with the work being done, all the experts being involved, we hope in the future to be able to make an educated assumption. So the more we find out, the better our assumption will be. So in conclusion, the coffin of Mer-Neith-it-es is a fascinating piece of ancient Egyptian burial equipment all on its own. The excavation of the contents has added a new dimension to the study. As I said earlier, if this was a complete mummy, we could not have undertaken a lot of the work that we have. This is not to say the decision to remove the contents was a decision taken lightly. In the future, people may say that this was the wrong thing to do, as we say about many of the earlier archaeological and conservation techniques. However, at this time, we believe the excavation was worth it. The ancient Egyptians wanted to be remembered, and now Mer-Neith-it-es's name has been and will be said over and over again. And the story of the person in the coffin, whether it be Mer-Neith-it-es or not, will be told. To end this, I'm going to play the short 3D film of the coffin and contents of the Lady Mer-Neith-it-es. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you.
Many thanks, Connie. Hello, everyone. My name is Therese Harrison. I work for Sydney Analytical, one of the core research facilities at the University of Sydney. I'm employed there as the Professional Officer for Museums Analyses. Sure. Or can I might slouch if that's all right. Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay, let's just hold it up against. See how you go.
Okay. Thank you. Our facility provides state-of-the-art instrumentation and technical expertise for vibrational spectroscopy, so Raman and infrared analysis, as well as X-ray, and we have capabilities in drug discovery and magnetic resonance. We also liaise with other core research facilities across the university, including Sydney Imaging, Sydney Microscopy and Microanalysis, and the Mass Spectrometry Facility. We were extremely thrilled when Jamie roped us in on this project and have been having a great opportunity to collaborate with him and some of the other presenters who have spoken here this evening. We're constantly finding out more about the coffin, so much so that many of the results that I have to present here have just actually been obtained yesterday and this morning. So they're hot off the press, and this is actually the first that Jamie's hearing of them as well. The scope of this mummy project is absolutely huge. It involves a number of collaborators, which has included a number of my colleagues. Pictured here, you can see Dr. Elizabeth Carter, our facility manager, who's here in the audience, and my colleague, Dr. Michelle Wood, both of whom have contributed enormously to this research as well. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about some of the discoveries that we've made, mainly about the contents of the coffin. I'm going to tell you about the textile wrappings, mummification balm, plant fibers, bone and wood fragments, as well as some of the pigment identification that's been undertaken on the exterior of the coffin. Okay, this slide looks a little bit different, and some of you might be wondering what all of these figures mean. I'll just explain, hopefully as painlessly as possible, what you're looking at here on these slides. Sydney Analytical, our techniques basically involve irradiating objects with different sources of energy, so lasers, X-ray, infrared light, and that energy interacts with the molecular structure and the chemistry of the material, and depending on how that interaction occurs, we get back a resulting spectrum that you can see here. All different materials interact differently with each of our different technologies, but essentially each material within each technique gives us something unique and identifiable, almost like a fingerprint of sorts. When you have mixtures, some mixtures can be really characteristic, but at other times, when you have mixtures of things that are really similar, like fats and oils or waxes, you can get an overlaid spectra that can be quite difficult to separate. So the textile wrappings prevented a relatively straightforward identification. Visual inspection of the textiles suggested that they were a linen, and this has obviously been well documented with Egyptian mummies. We were able to confirm so using infrared spectroscopy, which indicated a cellulosic material, and we were able to discern a pectin peak. This was consistent with plant fibers that we also found loosely distributed throughout the coffin. We have bone material which is yet to be analyzed, but we expect characterization to be relatively straightforward, as bone diagenesis, although not fully understood, is heavily studied. We've collected data on the wood, but interpretation of the spectra has taken a back seat, largely because Dr. Caroline Cartwright has already identified the wood, but we're hoping to isolate key features from our spectra that can act to support her findings. What has been far and away the most interesting thus far has been the analysis of the mummification balm. We found ourselves in the relatively unique position that the contents of the coffin were so heavily disturbed. There was such a mess of debris that where we would normally aim to undertake non-destructive analysis, we were granted the opportunity to, with some of the more brittle resin samples at least, to perform a simple extraction process and undertake GCMS, or gas chromatography mass spectrometry, which could provide us with a lot more information to understand our infrared spectra. You can see here some photographs of balm samples from the coffin. What you're looking at is an endocast, so it's listed as B there, from the cranial vault of the skull, some textile wrappings, C and D, with balm intermittent to the textile, and what appears to be a resin ear. The ear is large in size, and as Connie mentioned, it may have been incorporated decoratively, possibly having been added to represent a part missing from the physical body or denoting the propensity for the deceased for their ability to listen. It's well documented in the literature that Egyptian mummification balms can be comprised of a mixture of oils, fats, waxes, in particular beeswax, resins, gums, salts, bitumen, and various barks and spices. In archaeological samples such as these, varying states of degradation and the breadth of organic and inorganic materials poses a really big challenge for characterization. So, if you remember before, I mentioned that when you have a lot of similar things, it can be difficult to determine their composition. What we did is we set up an experiment to separate the constituents of the balm. So we took the parts that were soluble in an organic solvent, the parts soluble in water, and then the remaining fraction, so that we'd be able to get a clearer picture of what we were looking at. We found that all of the tested samples contained beeswax, but especially the ear had an extremely strong signal for wax. We also found that all of the samples, except for the ear, were made from resin from a conifer tree, and specifically we found biomarkers indicating that the tree comes from the pine family. It appears very much to us at the moment that the ear may not be made from a resin at all, but may instead be comprised largely of wax, which may fit well with the ornamental function that it may have performed. We have made some other discoveries in relation to the ear, but they're still a little bit new to announce, but certainly we have a lot more interesting ideas that we're hoping to explore further. We additionally found the presence of bitumen and of oils and fats, but we have a lot further to go, and we'll continue to look for biomarkers of salts, mastic resins, olibanum resins, which would indicate the use of frankincense, which has been found before, and we are hoping to further identify the botanical or animal origin of the different oils and fats. My colleague, Michelle Wood, has undertaken analysis of the beads found in the coffin, so I will just present some of the results of her research that she's passed on to me. As you know, over 7,000 beads were found in the coffin, and they were in all shapes and sizes. Visually, there appeared to be some differences in luster, which made us suspect that they were made from different materials. Faience was the most likely, and is one of the most characteristics of ancient Egyptian materials. It's essentially a quartz fritz with an outer coating of coloured vitreous glass. The core material was most often composed of raw sand, but could sometimes result in colouring the beads depending on where the sand had been sourced. There were then three major methods of glazing, by application, cementation, or efflorescence. By applying it, a slurry was painted or poured over the core material, which would result in an uneven glaze showing drip marks and flow lines. Cementation was the core material was buried in a glazing mixture, and efflorescence, the salts in the core material migrate to the surface to form a coating. In all of these three methods, the beads are then fired, which produces the glass-like appearance that you see. After analysis, Michelle was able to determine the following. The cream and yellow beads that you can see were coloured with antimony yellow, which has the same chemical composition of the perhaps more familiar Naples yellow, except for one of the very small quartz beads. Changes in the peak positions obtained indicated that they were prepared using similar firing temperatures. The red-brown beads were coloured with hematite, and the presence of azurine suggested a different source of core material compared with the other beads, which is likely Syene, an ancient city of southern Egypt. The black beads were coloured with magnesium black, derived from the mineral romanachite, and the green beads, which we actually thought would be more straightforward, appeared to have been produced using at least three different methods. XRF analysis gave different chemical constituents for all three of the beads that we looked at. Using Raman, only one spectrum revealed the use of antimony yellow, and a different bead presented completely different spectrum for which we've thus been unable to find a corresponding reference spectrum. The large variation in manufacturing methods suggests the net may have been made up of a collection of beads from different sources, and possibly may have been a cost-saving device. When we began looking at the Mer-Neith-it-es coffin, she was positioned on her back, facing upwards, and the amount of remnant pigments on the sides and was about as much as what you can see on the top and what you've seen previously in other presentations. So we were faced with quite a challenge trying to find any sort of signal. However, something that we did have were the clear remnants of the hieroglyphs that you can see, which seem to be etched onto the top of the coffin. And I'll come back to this in a second. We used a huge variety of portable instrumentation, but in the end, we had most success using XRF, or X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. XRF is able to give us details on the elemental constituents, and what we have found was quite dramatic. You can see here on the headdress of Mer-Neith-it-es that it varies from a darker to lighter color. It's not the pigment, but as we went through it with the XRF, every time we went over a darker area, we got a huge spike for copper. And when we moved just a centimetre to the side in one of the lighter areas, it completely fell away. So immediately we understood that we had a copper-based pigment, which made a lot of sense if we were to think that Egyptian blue was probably a likely component. The other thing that we could gather is that everywhere we examined that was a darkened area had this similar spike in copper. So basically it led us to believe that there's obviously some sort of interaction happening with the copper pigments and the wood. And we found further information documented in the literature, which suggests possibly copper chloride cancer, but certainly a reaction between that particular pigment and oils coming from the wood. And again, further analysis has to be undertaken. Our results on the top of the coffin also revealed the presence of arsenic, and immediately we suspected that this is most likely related to the yellow pigment orpiment. We had dominating signals for iron and calcium as well as other trace elements, but they had been quite confusing. Jamie then alerted us to the fact that the underside of the coffin had a lot more remnant pigment left, and I think it was best demonstrated in the WYSIWYG picture that you got, where you could actually see a little bit of the colour coming through. So once we began to use XRF on the underside of the coffin, we could actually see the pigment that we were analysing, and it sort of unlocked the front of the coffin a bit like a key. Every time we went over a yellow area, the arsenic signal shot up. So we were then able to correlate what was happening on the back of the coffin with what was happening on the front of the coffin. There's still a long way to go, so just before, I think in the hour before the coffin was then turned back up the right way, we thought we might just give one last try to one of our instruments, which was a small portable Raman spectrometer. And with that, we were actually able to identify a spectrum, but like a fingerprint basically for orpiment, carbon black, and hematite. So it was something that backed up what our XRF was saying and some of the leaps that we were making based on the chemistry. I'll leave you here now with Bernadette and Andrew, who are going to tell you a little bit more about the coloration of the coffin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's been wonderful to hear what the others in the team have been working on, so exciting for us to be here tonight too. I'm Bernadette Drabsch, and this is my colleague Andrew Howes. We're from the University of Newcastle, and we work in the School of Creative Industries. We're contacted by Jamie, who I know from working in Jordan. As Jamie mentioned, I flew in yesterday, so please forgive me if I lose track halfway through a sentence. I am slightly jet-lagged. But I've known Jamie for a long time, and we had a discussion when he first came across this coffin, and it was somewhere along the lines of, wouldn't it be wonderful to see what it looked like originally in its full colour? And we all said, yes, it would be. But obviously we can't come along with paint and repaint the original sarcophagus. So we had to come up with an alternate method, and that was to do it digitally. It's been amazing working with such a collaborative team and to have, as was mentioned earlier, one of the most high-res scans of a sarcophagus to work on. Wonderful and challenging because it has completely killed our computers that we normally work on, having such a massive file. So, you know, one of the challenges we've had to face was get a new computer at even higher, more highly powered computer to actually be able to undertake this project. As you can see, we've sort of taken on the challenge of trying to work out what the hieroglyphs would have looked like. From the scans you've just seen, they were very faded and we could only sort of make out little bits of colour. So our project has been to work out, with Therese and the team what colours might have been there originally and then to digitally put them back on.
Okay, thank you, Bernie. So the challenge for us was to come up with a process. We've never done this before. In terms of the digital process, trying to replicate a traditional handmade decorative process through a digital means and then reapply it back to the actual scan itself. So as natural history illustrators, our job is to create the most accurate interpretation we can as an artwork, as an illustration. They often serve as a good reference within science. So our process, we had to strip down what we normally do in a traditional approach, work with the team to figure out what we were looking at. That's the challenge, is if you can think about that scan turning around, how much you can see little glimpses of marks made on the surface. How do we find the rest of the picture? Try and figure out how it might have been made. Work with these guys to do the pigment analysis, find out what colour they would have been, and then put them back together. So what we've been doing is deconstructing the actual scan itself, and as you'll see in some of the slides, literally deconstructing it, taking the skin off and seeing what it looks like as a raw shape, seeing what these guys have, looking at comparative examples and seeing what we work with. We're used to seeing things in front of us and being able to draw them, reference them. The first part of this process has actually been trying to see what we have to bake as a new artwork. A major part of this is then working with the team, is bringing what we describe initially as preliminary drawings, describing what we see on the surface, getting some feedback, making sure that we are making a faithful representation, and then approaching that process of how do you reconstruct? How do you make the artwork? How do you apply it back to the scan? And then how do you render it back out? So like in the WYSIWYG fly-through, how do you then have a coffin that can turn around in front of you to see what it may have looked like originally? So in terms of how we work, our approach, normally when we were making any of our digital or traditional works, they're often taxonomic and have a clear sort of function describing something. We have to spend a lot of time looking, trying to figure out the intricate details and nuances of the things that we're going to describe. So the two main parts of our process really are observation. And so this is just, I guess, where the opportunity to work with the team is fantastic. All the resources that are being generated, as well as what we can see on the surface and our own use of software to try and extract and bring to the surface what we can't see so we then can remake it and put it back on. So some of the slides that we're going to run through are the process where we've been using a range of graphic software to take the scan that was supplied and try and draw to the surface those partial marks and see what the whole thing looks like. And then to be able to describe those so we can remake the element. Looking at a contextual review, so looking at comparative examples. What other artefacts are out there that we can look at and see how they may have looked or may have been made, and considering that as we remake the elements. And then obviously working with that pigment analysis to then recolour them. So this image here is obviously here the original scan that we've got, and this is running it through a program called D-Stretch. So what we're doing is trying to apply different filters that can look at the different colour gamuts and pull different things to the surface. So this is clearly, as Jamie said, it was a vibrant originally. I probably don't think it was that vibrant, but it's a tool that we're using to be able to pull different pigments and different marks to the surface, but the partial marks that we can see, we can fill in the rest from there. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of what we have on the screen in front of us there. We're trying to see what is the full marking across the chest here. So it's again, you can see running that colour gamut there, you can start to see some of the shapes coming, but then the darker pigments here, when you run it through this colour gamut, come up much sharper. So we might look at one section of the surface and have 3 or 4 reference images like this to try and see what the whole picture is that we're looking at. And from there, we start to get the shape, and then we can apply the pigment analysis back to it to try and recreate it from there.
So as well as using the latest technology like de-stretch, which some of you might be more familiar with in the world of rock art, that's used quite often in that sort of field. We're also doing very traditional research, and that's looking for comparative examples. So this is the area that I've sort of mainly been in charge of. Yeah, as you can see, we have a winged goddess on the front of the sarcophagus. So I've been trying to find comparisons so that we can sort of try to make out what ours might have looked like by looking at what others, how others were depicted. So it's using the technology, but also going through other sort of photographs of sarcophagus to look at what colours were used for this particular motif and how it might have been depicted originally. So we also looked at other painted surfaces with sarcophagus. So as you would have seen in the Nicholson Museum, sometimes they were prepared with a plaster surface like a gesso before the hieroglyphs were painted on there, but not always. Sometimes the hieroglyphs were painted straight onto the timber, as you can see in the top corner. So we were sort of trying to find comparisons so we would know how to then reconstruct our one to find out the most plausible way of reconstructing it. So it was involved quite a bit of research going through as many examples as we could find. Once we had done that, we moved on to the hieroglyphs themselves. So we looked at the main motifs first, the ones that were quite visible to the naked eye, and then we moved on to the hieroglyphs. So we used a mapping process. So we sort of went through each section of the sarcophagus and went through individually each hieroglyph and consulted with Professor Boyo from Macquarie University, who is the hieroglyphic expert, and said, we think it might look like this. And he would say, no, it doesn't look like that. It looks like this. It was that sort of backwards and forwards collaborative process, which is just wonderful to work with specialists who actually know what they're talking about. We're artists, we're not hieroglyphic specialists. So, it was wonderful to actually be able to sort of sometimes surprise him when we saw things that he hadn't seen before, and would come down and say, look, we can see the 4 sons of Horus along the side of it. And he goes, oh, so they are, or something like that. So, it has been an exciting process of mapping the surface with the individual motifs as we're going. So this was what that looked like. So we sort of came down, we had a sort of big printed out sheets of the individual panels, particularly from the back of the sarcophagus. As Therese and Connie mentioned, the back was better preserved because it wasn't exposed to the light. So we could actually see the hieroglyphs more easily on the back with some of the pigment still there. So we went through using de-stretch and doing sort of little outlines around as many of the ones that we could actually see, and produced a bit of a map of some of the hieroglyphs that we could now make out more clearly. And then through that process, we also worked with Therese to work out which ones we wanted to get the pigments tested from, so we would know what colour to paint digitally back over that surface. So this is one, as I just mentioned, we found some figures as well as the hieroglyphs. So this is one of the 4 sons of Horus that we identified down the side of the sarcophagus. And as you can see, it's a little bit difficult to sort of make out on the surface, but when you've been looking at these things for hours and hours and hours on end, they actually become much more obvious. And that was sort of what was happening, to Andrew and I. Would just be looking at these things and we could see them, and then we realised that nobody else could. So we would sort of do a bit of a sketch and sort of, draw lines across saying, here, Jamie, you can see this. And then eventually it's like, oh, yes, of course I can see that. It has been a fun process of these things just coming to life in front of us.
So this is what we're presented with from WYSIWYG in the capture. So there's 2 parts to our story. We have the actual model there, and we essentially have the skin wrapped around the outside. It comes in pieces, so it has to be put back together to start with. So this is one section of the lid. So the first part of the process with our sort of technical officer there was to put the model back together. And then, as you can see, the the section that maps back onto it isn't just wrapping a picture around the outside, it's actually broken down into different pixels and sits and wraps around the surface. So we couldn't just open this up, find the part and put the colour back over the top. We're trying to look at the process of how in a 3D environment turn around and sort of live paint these things back on, and that's what we're experimenting with at the moment, is the process of how you apply the colour back. So we've got the discovery side of it where we're looking at the surface, we're seeing the lines, drawing the shapes, hoping people see the same thing, and then try and understand what's there, and then is, okay, well, how can we actually do that in the 3D environment? What we're trying to do is keep the most faithful representation of a handmade process. We don't want it to look digital in the end in terms of the colorization process. So part of that sort of comparative looking at the examples is what are the kind of tools that we use to make this? How do you make that kind of line? So we're treating very sensitively the things that we're looking at. So we're faced with this, and you can see, even if I can just grab that one tick, just on the model there, you can see little divots here. So you can see the pigment at that point is actually etched into the surface. So we're using all the different resources that we've got to try and see what the marks are, and then work on a process for replicating it from there. So, okay, just to give you an example, it's quite a crude sort of example, but this is the unwrapped scan. This is what we're presented with as that sort of weathered sort of aged texture, and this is just an experiment to show you what it looks like when you can rewrap it with a texture. We're not trying to necessarily put a new piece of timber on it, but just to give you an idea of, if you're trying to bring it back to life, where we might boost some of the colours, the grains of it, to bring it back and show what that timber might have looked like. The challenge for us is, if you can see on the surface here, you've got sections of resin here, you've got the grain of the timber, then you've also got the marks that were made by hand. They all have quite a dark pigment to them, so if you boost that up, you're exaggerating the grain, you're exaggerating the line drawn, you're exaggerating the material that might fill it in. So it's not necessarily as straightforward as just bringing up the intensity or the brightness. It's trying to figure out how you can replicate the substrate, the timber, and then also put the artwork back on top of it. Okay, this is just an example of some preliminary experimentation. What we have to work with is a very iterative process, where we're sort of taking all those inputs in terms of the comparative examples, find something that we've drawn by hand that maps the surface of the original shape, and then use a range of traditional and digital tools to try and replicate the line work and the colour, and then put them back on. These are obviously just placeholder images as a testing sort of phase, but just to give you an idea of how you might put either the gessoed surface or the timber surface back on, and then how you might reapply the hieroglyphs, making sure they're exactly the same shape and registration point as they came from. All right, cool. Just as an example here, this was one of the registers that had a clearer set of hieroglyphs that we could look at, and we would line up 3 or 4 different variations of the same thing to try and see where we could see the sharpest edge, where we could see the difference in pigment, and where we could find a detail that you couldn't see in one of the variations from there. Some of the challenges too are that and we have to think about it as image makers. John loved taking pictures. I've always loved making pictures. So the making process for us is part of the thinking. If you have a porous substrate and you put materials onto it, was it a prime surface? Okay, the lines are quite sharp, but the didn't bleed, so this must have been sealed. How is it sealed? Do the colours go down first, the lines? And looking at the making process, and this helps us figure out some of those elements and try and work backwards in terms of the making phase.
So as Andrew mentioned, we're sort of at that stage now where we are I wouldn't say fairly confident, but we're, getting a little bit more confident about the hieroglyphs and what we need to put back on now through that sort of iterative process and the collaboration with others. So we're at that stage now. It's still the very beginning of the actual recolouring, but we're at the stage now where we're ready to actually start applying the colours, from the data coming from the scientists and from the consultation with the Egyptologists and hieroglyphic specialists. We can now sort of come back in and say, okay, we can see the dark line around the hieroglyphs, so that would have had some sort of dark line, even though if it was up to us as artists, we probably wouldn't put the outline on there, but we have to, because we want this to be as accurate to the original as possible. So this is sort of just showing, what it might sort of look like at the end. It will be a full digital scan that you can have the colour on it or not, depending on what we want to show. You can sort of zoom into different areas of it, and look, this is the actual name of Mer-Neith-it-es herself. So if you look at it from the beginning, working down the name, you've got all of the hieroglyphs that spells out the name Mer-Neith-it-es. One of the things that we're particularly interested in this part of her name was sometimes she has a beard and sometimes she doesn't, and sometimes she has the female determinative above the name and sometimes she doesn't. And I just love that part of the story. It's coming to life as we work on it. We're finding new things every time we look at it, and it has been by far the most exciting project I think we've ever worked on. So thank you, Jamie, for inviting us.
I know just how hard the benches are in the General Lecture Theatre. You have all done incredibly well. You may have seen these two banners here. We've got another two up in the Nicholson Museum. They are showing some of the CT images, some of the remarkable CT images that Macquarie Medical Imaging was able to produce for our 4 mummies. We won't put them in the gallery permanently, but you may know that every Monday at 3:30 we take a free tour of the Nicholson. No need to book, just turn up. And so for the next couple of Mondays at 3:30, I'll have these banners in our Egyptian gallery, and I'll do a tour of the Egyptian gallery based on this mummy project. You're very welcome. Just be in the foyer 3:30 on a Monday afternoon. You've seen a lot of science and CT and spectroscopy, etc., etc. Really, if you take one thing away from this evening, let it be this. There is nothing more exhilarating than to work on something with people who know what they're doing. Now, one of the reasons why I haven't spoken much is because I don't know what I'm doing most of the time, particularly when it comes to Egyptology. But with the mummy project, well, my father would say, go to the best or do without. And I think what we've done is been able to work with some of the best minds working on this sort of stuff anywhere in the world. Why are we doing all this? We're doing all this because of this new museum. The Chow Chak Wing Museum, which is scheduled to open July next year, will have in it a dedicated mummy room. And in that room, we will show these coffins and these mummies and incorporate the CT imagery, the reconstructed colour, and all of this sort of thing, and take people on a journey of how we study Egyptian mummies and what are the sorts of questions that we can answer by using science, Egyptology, traditional archaeology. Ultimately, I think what I hope we're doing is really respecting a motif that was often written onto coffins or onto the walls of Egyptian tombs, which would go something like, "Speak my name so that I may live again." And I hope in the mummy room we're speaking these names of Mer-Neith-it-es and Horus and Pedi-Ashiket and Meroa more times than they've been spoken of in the last 2,000 years. And I'm very glad you're all able to share in that journey with us tonight. Before I ask you to thank our speakers for one last time, we will be serving more drinks and some of the Nicholson Museum ice creams in the galleries. Please come and recover from the benches with a drink and an ice cream. And please thank all our speakers and remarkable collaborators. Thank you, everybody.